My name's Winifred Lewis. For those that don't know me, I'm the director of the Social Change Lab, and we're throwing this festival, the Australian Festival of Democracy and Human Rights. And I'd love to thank my speakers, our speakers today, as well as Christine, who's with me here and without whom nothing happens. And we've had some wonderful events all day, but I'm really looking forward to this panel, which I think is addressing a vital topic in society, and very difficult to have a conversation about faith and democracy without being drowned out by shouting. But our speakers today are going to illuminate that topic with their wisdom. Just to let you know, first just to acknowledge country. So along with the University of Queensland, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we're meeting today. Here in Meanjin, Brisbane, the contested lands of the Turrbal and Niagara people. And wherever you are, I acknowledge elders past and present, and recognize their continuing cultural and spiritual connections to country. When it comes to faith, spirituality, and religion, and the relationship of that to governance, Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing have a lot to teach us. And I'm sure that'll come out in the talk today. We are recording, and for later use, we'll broadcast it on our YouTube channel. If you do not wish to be recorded, simply leave your video off and post your comments in the chat. The edited recording will be available, and if you'd like to be added to our mailing list to receive invitation to our future events, you can reach out to us at socialchangelab.uq@gmail. We do have a culture of communication in the lab. We try to start on time and finish on time, so that might mean that a gripping conversation is cut off. We also try to stay on topic rather than digress too far. And importantly, we don't expect everyone in the Zoom to have the same opinion. We don't expect to agree with everyone. And we practice the lost arts of listening with respect and disagreeing with civility when the need arises. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our four speakers, and I'll be going through in order, asking them to give their introductory remarks of around 5 to 10 minutes each. So Sister Wendy Flannery, Father Duncan Gorwood, Professor Michele Grossman, Professor Halim Rane. And I'll begin with you, Wendy, if you'd like to share your slides.
Okay, I'll start. I'll just say a few words first.
Okay.
I'm actually talking about a specific case study based on a historical situation to illustrate the point of faith, democracy, and human rights. So you will all remember the event that was called 9/11 that happened in New York City. And at the time, I was actually connected with an NGO working at the UN at the time. Back in Australia in 2003, I discovered that there was a huge amount of anti-Muslim sentiment, and a lot of it was directed at women because women were identifiable. Many Muslim women were identifiable by their clothing. So I called together a few friends who were working in human rights and social justice to discuss how we could respond. And we decided that we'd try to create a group where women of faith could share with each other. And the Muslim woman who was part of that conversation said that it should be women of all faith, not just Christians and Muslims. So that's what we started out with. We had several conversations during 2003, and at the end of that year, we decided we would start a group, and it was launched in March 2004. So I'm just going to show a few slides about the group quickly. Okay, so we called it Believing Women for a Culture of Peace. And the idea of a culture of believing women, women of faith, a culture of peace came from a UNESCO manifesto that was issued for the year 2000 on building a culture of peace. So that's where we got our name from. We ended up choosing that symbol You can see there that the prongs of the circle going around, showing movement. All of them are equal and moving through a channel of water to show the movement that's happening as the circle turns. Okay, so this was the UNESCO Manifesto. You can look that up yourself later. UNESCO Manifesto for a Culture of Peace and Non-Violence. So I'll pass that over. So this was our vision. Living in a world where people of diverse faiths and cultural backgrounds mingle together as never before, believing women find themselves called to cultivate deep mutual respect across faiths and cultures, develop relationships based on what we have in common, and including, of course, Indigenous spiritualities. Fashion the diversity of our spiritual and cultural resources into a powerful good of society as a whole, and counteract the potential of religious and cultural differences for divisiveness and conflict, contribute to a lasting culture of peace. Okay, so now this was an event in King George Square with the Queensland Women's Department for International Women's Day in 2006, I think it was. Some of our members there and participated in the presentations. So we worked a lot with the Griffith University Multi-Faith Centre and started a Women to Women dialogue series. What women in multi-faith and multicultural society really think and want. So it was storytelling and so on. So we had a lot of activities like that. This was International Women's Day in State Parliament. I'm trying to think if Halim's wife Nora is there. She probably is, but I can't see her.
Second row.
Okay, good. Okay, this was a special publication that we published, Flying with Two Wings, a multi-faith toolkit addressing violence against women, and each of the member groups of our association was asked to contribute something to that booklet, and we shared it widely. So we had ongoing dialogues, we had contacts with various organisations, small group events and activities, public events, and an exhibition at St. John's Cathedral on Women of Peace. And I think altogether we had 17 different faith groups represented over time in the association. Okay, that's the end of the slides. I'll stop sharing, just say a few more words. So we had links with a lot of other women's organisations as well, with human rights organisations, universities, and involvement in multicultural activities. Working in the Greater Brisbane area, but also we went to one event in Warwick, some in Toowoomba, Gold Coast, and Sunshine Coast. And in 2017 and 2019, we sponsored a woman named Fakanda Chowdhury, a Muslim woman from Scotland, to run training programs on religion, religious diversity and anti-discrimination. And those were held in Brisbane, Gold Coast and Toowoomba. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the activities we did. So both small and intimate and large in the public arena. And that was the way we tried to lobby for the recognition that people of faiths are committed to human rights and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for that talk and for your great work with that group, which sounds amazing. I think I recall some of those events, and yeah, they're just spectacular and incredible achievement. Over to you, Father Duncan. Did you want to speak next?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Jolly good. So thank you for having me. My name is Father Duncan Gorwood. I'm parish priest for All Saints Wickham Terrace. I haven't prepared any slides, partly because I don't trust technology and I'm not very good at it. So instead, what I want to do is talk a little bit about why people of faith, and particularly I think of Christian faith, but of all Abrahamic religions, should be called to an appreciation and a contribution to a democratic life. I think in terms of Christianity, from the earliest times, the church has demonstrated the fact that it really isn't an autocracy, and it's always had elements of democracy that have created the church as we understand it today. Now, of course, there are many different brands of Christianity. There are of most faiths, and they are all governed in some shape or form through either synodical governance, through councils, and even in the origins of the early church, we see ecumenical councils were drawn together to start to develop ideas about how the church could speak into the issues of the day. I belong to a part of the church. I'm an Anglican, and obviously, if you recognise the accent, I was born and bred in the UK, but I'm in particular what's called an Anglo-Catholic. I belong to a movement that has its origins in Victorian England and was a particularly powerful movement for what I would call Christian socialism. And I think my life has been very shaped by it. There are lots of people get a bit confused about what Anglo-Catholicism is and why it's so distinctive, and they think it's all about what we call high churchery, which is waving lots of incense around and having bells and things like that. And those things are really important to me. But what I understand through that is that the grace which is imparted through the sacraments of the church empowers those of us who are in that tradition to go out and perform mission to the world, and in particular to those who are in need of help. And this dates back to the earliest kind of founding fathers, really, of the movement, which I'm part of. Most of them were Oxford academics, actually, who came up with some really radical ideas about social reform. And they rooted themselves in communities that were needy and impoverished. In actual fact, they rooted themselves in the slums of London. They went up to the north of England to really impoverished working class environments, and they sought to both raise an awareness of God, but also the beauty of worship, but also of the need to love one another in the way that that Jesus demonstrated his love for us, and live their lives incarnationally, live their lives in the image of him, serving others and drawing others into his message. And I think that to be a Christian, to live the Christian life to its fullest sense, one has to take an active role in democracy. I think it's tricky because biblically, democracies didn't really exist as we understand them today at the time of the biblical canon. However, there is clear evidence from the teachings of Christ and St. Paul that we should, whilst living according to the laws of the country that we are a part of, we should also contribute socially where we can to its democratic processes. I suppose the final thing I would say is that the Anglican Church throughout the world isn't united by many things, but there is one thing that I think the Anglican Church has done which I really approve of, and that's that it established some marks of mission. And really throughout the world, Anglican churches in the Anglican Communion subscribe to 5 marks of mission. And one of those marks of mission, which has always profoundly spoken in my life, is the desire to transform unjust structures and challenge violence. And I think that's very much underpins a lot of the work that we try to do, both in this parish, in this community, working alongside people in need here in Brisbane, but also globally. I think there is a real call to Christian socialism and to the contribution that we can make to stand up to unjust structures and unjust societal actions. I don't necessarily think we do it robustly enough, but I think it's an absolute call that's at the very heart of the Christian faith, and particularly at the heart of the movement that I'm a part of.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's just inspiring to hear from two practitioners, and more by luck than by design. And we now turn to two scholars who I suspect will be telling us less idealistic and more more academically statistical presentations. But I could be totally wrong. Don't let me stop you from being idealistic, Michele and Halim. So thank you, Father Duncan. And now over to you, Michele.
Thanks very much, Winifred. I'm definitely going to be at the nerdy, I'll be the nerd presentation of the panel, I have a feeling, because I'm going to want to talk in a second about religion and the state and governance and religion, governance of religion in Australia. Let me just share a slide. Okay, can you all see that slide now? And if can you still see the slide?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Okay. So look, what I thought I would spend my 10 minutes talking about, and Winifred, don't hesitate.
Oh, sorry, it's gone to your speech now, Michele.
Is it still gone to my speech?
Yeah, the slide has disappeared and we can see your speech on the screen.
Can you see the slide now?
No.
That's
Yes.
good. So you can't see. Okay, hold on a minute. Sorry about this, everybody, but I think what this means, I'm going to have to not share the slide because I actually need my notes. But I can put it back up if need be. Look, what I'd really like to spend a few minutes talking with you about is how does our idea about Australia being a secular liberal democracy actually relate to and help us understand the relationship between religion and the state in Australia. So one of the things that many people, believe when they think about secularism is that they think that a secular state is basically against religion or anti-religion. And in fact, there are some states, and I'm thinking here of a country like France, where we've seen all sorts of conflagrations about the role of religion in that nation, and also about how the government manages religion. So you could be forgiven for thinking that in a country like France, which practices radical secularism, that is the case. But in Australia, it's a little bit different. So secular in the Australian context should not be interpreted, in my view, to mean non or anti-religious. Instead, what various scholars have talked about in terms of how Australia, and particularly the Australian Constitution, approaches religion, is to think of it in terms of what some people call open secularism, and what some other scholars call liberal separationalism. And I'll explain those terms in a minute. So, and both of them, I should say, are really reflected in the prohibition in the Australian Constitution on interference in the free exercise of any religion. Australia has no national religion. Section 116 of the Constitution actually forbids setting up any laws that establish a religious body or organization. So the position of the Constitution is to say something about the way that religion is managed by government, and particularly how it's managed relative to other rights and freedoms, including human rights, and what might overstep the boundaries in one case or another. So as a principle, the Constitution's treatment of religious freedom works on the basis that religious beliefs and practices are voluntary and private matters for citizens. The people should be free to choose to exercise, or indeed to refrain from exercising, any religious beliefs or practices, as long as they don't interfere with the human rights or freedoms of others within the laws of the country, in this case, Australia. So a belief in liberal democracy's protection of minority rights, which is one of the core tenets of liberal democracy, going right back to its origins, has really been at the core of many Australian citizens' faith in democracy as a system that will allow them to practice their religion freely as long as this doesn't infringe on the human rights of others. But let's take a look for a moment at how this has actually worked in practice, because we live in a federated system where we have the Commonwealth, and then, of course, we have the states and the territories. Now, the Australian Constitution's prohibition on the interference in the exercise of religion applies to Commonwealth law. It actually does not apply to the states and territories. This is something that, people often, don't appreciate. So states and territories are left free to legislate on various religious matters. And this includes things like being able to discriminate on the basis of religion. A sporting club who only wants to admit people of a certain religious faith but deny others entry. Matters related to employment, matters related to housing and so forth. States and territories are free to actually legislate on those issues in relation to religion. Now, in practice, states and territories have largely, not entirely, but largely adhered to the principle of non-interference that is established by the Constitution. But interestingly, there have been a couple of attempts to do something about this. So there were some amendments proposed in 1944, that sought to tighten things up a little bit in the democratic rights referendum in 1944 and again in 1988, where they looked at questions that attempted to increase constitutional protections for various civil rights, including freedom of religion. But neither of those efforts to amend the Constitution in 44 or in 88 in the 20th century, were successful. Now, one of the key problems that this has raised for many people is that it's actually the prohibition on interference is not the same as a proactive stance on trying to assert religious freedom. And so, the Australian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, for example, in 1998, it said the level of protection afforded to the right to freedom of religion and belief in Australia is pretty weak when you compare it to a number of other comparable Western liberal democracy. So this argument basically says, look, there's a constitutional guarantee that nobody's going to interfere at the Commonwealth level with free exercise of religion, but it's merely a restrictive position. It doesn't actively assert and protect religious freedom and anti-discrimination rights of Australian citizens. And in fact, it leaves that to the states and territories where, may I say, those protections are notably uneven. Yeah, so depending on where you live, you'll have different protections and different rights or absence of rights relative to another state or territory. Now, a lot of this was brought to a head in 2017 and 2018 when we had the Religious Freedom Review, which was commissioned by government. It was a Commonwealth review. They listened carefully to members of Australian religious minority groups who have long claimed experiences and accounts of discrimination in relation to religious identity and sought greater legislative protection. And one of the really interesting moments, I think, in this was around the Marriage Equality Act, right, in 2017, which in some ways was the spur for the Religious Freedom Review, because although that bill was passed almost unanimously in Parliament in a bipartisan fashion, religious opponents of the bill actually argued that it would harm gender education, religious freedom, and freedom of speech. So you can start to see the complexity of who gets to argue about what kinds of religious freedoms are being impeded or infringed upon in relation to the human rights of others. So, I don't have time, obviously, to go into the review's outcomes in any detail, but it is notable that of the three pieces of major legislation that actually arose out of the Religious Freedom Review, so that was the religious discrimination, they were all in 2019. There was a proposal for a religious discrimination bill, a religious discrimination consequential amendments bill, and a human legislation amendment, freedom of religion bill. Of those three, none of them passed. None of them passed. They got shelved, and then they got permanently shelved. They were all finished by 2022, and nothing got up. So as I come to a close in these remarks, I think that what we can say is that when you look at Australia's transition towards the governance of religion within what you might call a pro-diversity framework that would fit with other elements since the 1970s of a multicultural framework based on principles of open secularism, three of the four principles that characterize open secularism, namely the moral equality of persons, freedom of conscience and religion, and the separation of church and state, continue to a large degree, to characterize the contemporary Australian landscape of state-religion relations. But the fourth principle of open secularism, which is state neutrality in respect of religious and deep-seated secular convictions, is probably more fragile and contested. So existing approaches to religious freedom in Australia are now tending, and I think we've seen this, in a variety of contexts that we can perhaps talk about in the discussion section, is now tending towards increasing accommodation of exceptionalism in terms of the power to discriminate based on religion. Yeah. And this is an inconsistent position in regard to state neutrality because it allows discrimination on the basis of religion in ways that do definitely potentially infringe on the human rights of others. Education and sport are two examples, where this continues to be a really hot topic. So religious minorities in Australia have historically benefited from the historical structural accommodations that open secularism brings, and probably from more recent moves towards policy-based inclusion and recognition. But both non-religious and non-institutional religious sentiments and movements are also on the rise. So we've seen, at least in the past decade, the kind of escalating rhetoric that continues, to dog popular and also, I would say, populist debates around immigration, the so-called lack of cultural fit between various minorities and the Australian mainstream, and in particular, the normalizing and mainstreaming of extreme far-right anti-religious minority sentiments in both popular and party political Australian life. So I think that this, environment of increased political polarization in public discourse, the decline of trust, that the Edelman barometer reminds us is getting worse, every year in Australia, as elsewhere. This really poses risks in terms of the normalization of extremism of both religious and non-religious varieties, and that we really need to remain vigilant that the kind of risky dynamics we're now seeing around state-religion relations, don't overtake the protections that we currently have when it comes to the democratic protection of freedom of religion as a human right in ways that do not co-opt, ignore, or damage other human rights that we also hold dear. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Michele. And we'll maybe have a look at your slide afterwards, but I'll go over to you now, Halim, and we'll now see whether you're going to join the nerd side of the presentation or speak from the ideological heart.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'll let you all be the judge of that. I'm coming to you from Meerjin, Brisbane, the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am at the moment. So I'll speak about Islam and democracy, and I'll begin by talking about, sort of the religious historical background, and then I'll move into the more contemporary, and I'll focus on the Australian context as well in that regard. So Islam is not a religion that one would normally think about in terms of having a very strong democratic tradition. And I don't think that it does historically. When I use the word Islam, I should probably just make a clarification there. When I talk about Islam, I'm talking about the religion that was established by the Prophet Muhammad in his lifetime. And the basis of that is the Quran. And of course, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, his followers continued to practice and you could say develop in some respects, socially, politically, and in other ways. But those developments that took place after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, I wouldn't categorize as Islam as the religion proper. The religion proper really is confined to the Quran and what the Prophet Muhammad had established during his lifetime on the basis of those revelations of the Quran. So I'll make the distinction between those two things. So when we talk about the concept of the caliphate, of Sharia law, all of these things take place after the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And so I think there's a need to make that distinction. Now, that said, when we look at the Quran, which is the foundational scripture of Islam, we do find democratic principles very clearly, across the book, such as the concept of shura, which is consultation, or ijma, consensus, the concept of bay'ah, which you could say relates to the idea of electing a leader, but it's certainly in the context of the Quran referred to an oath of allegiance to that person who was nominated or elected or supported by people to lead them. And then, of course, we've got a lot of discussion about covenants, the concepts of ahad and mithaq, basically formal agreements and binding commitments that define how people should live together, regulating, relationships between human beings and God, and between, groupings of humans, nations, and communities, and so on. Then, of course, there's other very important principles in the Quran around recognition of other religions. Obviously, those who belong to the Christian and Jewish communities were, in the proximity of the Prophet Muhammad. So they're discussed quite a lot in the Quran, and they're acknowledged and recognized, including for the protection of their places of worship. Monasteries, churches, synagogues are specifically mentioned in the Quran as places of worship that are to be protected. And then, of course, there's the principle of no coercion in religion. So not only does the Quran recognize other religious communities and the need to coexist with them, but also that there's a prohibition on forcing or compelling people to adopt the message that the Prophet Muhammad was conveying. And by the way, the Quran presents that message that he's conveying not as a new religion, but as a renewal of the same monotheistic religion that comes through the tradition of Abraham. So just that bit of background. So there are democratic principles in the holy sacred text of Islam, the Quran, and in the practice of the Prophet Muhammad, though it's notable that Muslims never developed a democratic system. And it's not that they weren't aware of the democratic systems. I mean, they had very deep knowledge of the Greeks. It's because of the Muslims translating the works of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates that we actually have that preserved today. So the Muslims were aware of, the democratic traditions, but I suppose we could say they were not normative at the time. They were not normative, certainly not in Arabia and even beyond, not in Persia, not even in the Levant or those lands ruled by the Byzantine Empire or across North Africa. So in the 7th century, in the world in which Islam developed, we don't have a very strong democratic tradition that one could point to or adopt. And perhaps that's part of the reason why the Muslims didn't adopt any form of democracy, because that wasn't normative at the time. When the Muslims spread out of the Arabian Peninsula, they conquered the lands of the Persians and the Byzantine, and they essentially became the new rulers in these lands, and they largely continued on with the system of governance that was there before, though they introduced their own administrative and legal systems and so forth, change the taxation system and that sort of thing, but still no indication of any democratic system developing. Generally speaking, the world at the time was dominated by monarchies, and Muslims continued on, and they ended up practicing that tradition as well. Though the system of monarchy has no basis in the Quran, other than references to it, such as Solomon taking over from David, for example. But there's nothing inherently Islamic about a monarchy system. Really, Islamic political thought historically suggested a few different options. One is that, the ruler should be from the family of the Prophet Muhammad. Another view said that it should be the most pious and learned person. And then there's probably a third view, which was the sort of dominant Sunni view, you could say, or what became the Sunni view, which was that anybody could rule, but they should be from the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad, which was known as the Quraysh tribe. So, as we go through the Umayyads, the Abbasid, the various other Muslim empires that came and went, we could see this continue on of an empire and a system, based largely on monarchy, but not entirely. So we have a caliphate system, we have an imamate system as the sort of main approaches to governance. If we fast forward to towards the modern world, we have the Muslim world being under European colonial rule for an extended period of time. In some places it was, half a century or more. In some places it was a few centuries. And so within that, you have a very authoritarian system of rule and, no sort of democratic system of governance while under colonial rule. Though I suppose you could say some countries did come into contact with democratic rule, like Malaysia, for example, through perhaps their colonial experience. And so in the aftermath of colonialism, some Muslim countries, developed systems that were, that you could see as democratic. Malaysia, is an example of that. But in the post-colonial world, we really see Muslim majority countries being dominated by either the monarchies that were put in place as the colonial rulers left, or the military that perhaps took over from them, or some other usually authoritarian system of government. And so if we jump forward to, say, 2010, 11, 12, when we have the Arab Spring, that was really about people calling for freedom and democracy. And so, always under the surface there, Muslims didn't necessarily object to democracy. And in fact, what we could see from the Arab Spring is this was preferable to the authoritarian systems that had been in place from colonial times and in the post-colonial era. And another thing we notice that it is taking place sort of from the 2000s, but certainly from around 2010, is the development of a political system that we could loosely call Islamic democracy. Islamically oriented political parties that want to have a democratic system. Probably the earlier example of this is Turkey's AKP, though it would not classify itself as Islamic, but it would call itself a conservative democracy, but it is often referred to as a Islamically oriented system. And then from there, we have the PJD in Morocco, the Ennahda Party in Tunisia, PKR in Malaysia, PKS in Indonesia, Imran Khan's party in Pakistan. So we have many examples where you've got an Islamically oriented party that wants to have democracy in their country. And this seems to be, poll data suggests that, throughout this century, there's majorities of Muslims have supported that type of government. But we could see what happened in the aftermath of the Arab Spring in that essentially those democratic gains were all crushed. And nowhere have we seen really a democracy flourish in any of those countries. Not in Egypt. There was a coup for about 12 months. So we're back to military rule there. Also, democratic gains had been reversed in Tunisia. And while the Western governments, like the United States, for example, were not sufficiently supportive, I think the biggest problem was countries like the UAE, for example, that actively sought to undermine those democratic gains from the Arab Spring because they don't want to see an Islamically oriented alternative to the monarchies that they have established. That for them, that would be a threat to their legitimacy and their hold on rule. And so, there is a lot of factors that sort of contribute to the undermining of democracy in the Muslim world. On the one hand, you've got those, Middle East, the Gulf regimes like the UAE. And on the other hand, you've got United States, Britain, France, not being seriously supportive of democracy, and in fact, supporting authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. Examples of that go back to the 1940s Syria, 1950s Iran. During the Cold War, open support for more dictatorial regimes like in Indonesia, for example. Lack of support for democratic elections that took place in Palestine in 2006. Algeria in the 1990s. There's many examples that we could cite. So there hasn't been serious support for democracy in the Muslim world where it had started to develop. I'll just jump forward to Australia and note that there's a fair amount of poll data that has asked about democracy and the views of democracy among Muslims in Australia. And while I think there was some pushback from some of the imams and others, if you go back to the early 2000s, but over subsequent decades, it seems as though there's been a lot more support for democracy and a lot more encouragement for Muslims to participate politically. A study that we did in 2019 was the Islam in Australia survey. And it found that about 80% of the survey respondents, and it was a pretty large sample, it was over 1,000 Australian Muslim citizens and permanent residents, about 80% of them said that, Islam is compatible with democracy, completely or mostly compatible. So that's a strong indicator. And there were other questions on the survey that indicated quite strong support for democracy. But we should also note that in Australia itself, if you look at the Lowy Institute poll data, it indicates for several years now there's been declining support for democracy, particularly among young people. They don't consider it to be, the preferred or the ideal form of government. I think there's a bit of disillusion with democracy, and largely that seems to be because the way it's working is governments aren't seen to be working for the people in general, but for elites, corporate elites and so forth. Lobbying, foreign lobby groups and so forth tend to get more support from government than, ordinary Australians do. And I think Muslims perceive this as well as do, other Australians. But the other indicator of strong support for democracy in Australia from within the Muslim community is the development of MVM, Muslim Votes Matter. So this is an organisation that has come about since the last election, really to educate Muslims about the importance of voting, how to make a valid vote, and then providing them with information about where particular candidates stand on a whole range of different issues so that Muslims can be more informed when they go to the ballot box. So it's not only encouraging Muslims to go and vote, but enabling them to do it in a more informed way. So that's a clear indication that Muslims are becoming more politically engaged and politically aware as well. But, if we think about democracy, and I'll conclude with this point more generally, democracy works best if there are some preconditions already in place. And that would include, a robust education system that ensures that people, when they go to the polls, they're fully informed, a responsible, free and fair media. And perhaps that's something that we, are lacking to some extent here in Australia, particularly over the last, you could say, few decades, perhaps. And that perhaps is undermining the effectiveness of our democracy. But the other issue, I guess, is the question.
I might jump in there and say I would like to have some time for discussion, but maybe.
I'll just conclude with a final point, and that is that at the end of the day, it comes down to how do we live together, and what are the what's the framework for people living together. And I think this concept of covenant is quite important in that respect. But I'll stop there and let's have some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you for such rich and diverse introductions to this topic. I mean, I guess I'm conscious that with everyone being so articulate, we may only have time really for one question and series of answers. And I'll ask everyone to be mindful of dividing our 16 minutes roughly among 4 respondents, so you don't take too much more than 4 minutes. yeah, let's take up that question. So there are more and more Australians who have no religion. And if I were to characterize what I think they think about religion, it's that it's a pernicious force and that people who are more religious are more divided and more divisive. But there are also changing profiles of religion. The Christian faith is dropping and secularizing more rapidly. Some other faiths are growing. And some people characterize that there are religious differences such that people in one faith, as Michele reported that others say, I should say, are better citizens somehow, better suited to democracy. And then there's this pun that I wanted to ask you guys to engage, that you've mentioned, Halim, and that you also touched on, Michele, that people are losing their faith in democracy, that they don't believe that it's effective. And to some extent, you need to be motivated pro-socially and out of civic duty to engage democracy, or it will stop working. So in that context, Wendy, what would you say, and the rest of you, how can people of good faith act to strengthen democracy in Australia? Over to you.
Well, I think we can work within our own traditions, of course, this happens in my tradition. I'm in the Roman Catholic tradition, and I think a lot of it happens through two main channels. One is justice and peace organisations that work towards that vision, and community service organisations like the St. Vincent de Paul Society, for example. So those organisations reach across the spectrum and try to promote the positive values of democracy and human rights in the various contexts that they work. Of course, it doesn't always ring true in the different local communities. Some local communities in the church don't want to hear those messages, but it's one way of trying, at least, to keep those messages alive.
Oh, thank you. And I'll just keep going in the same order as the speakers. So, Father Duncan?
Yeah, I suppose one of the things I would say, I would fully agree with everything that Wendy said. I think that there is another element which I've tried to develop here in this parish particularly, which is an openness about difference of opinion and a willingness to engage in debate. I think most of my parishioners know where I stand politically on most things because I'm quite open about it. And I actually, they don't agree with me politically, I think it's fair to say. There's this saying that's very common amongst Anglican priests, which is that most people who come to church and sit in our pews are quite conservative. Most people that have a vocation to the priesthood tend to be left of centre. So there is an inherent difference often of political opinion. But what's often happened, I think, is that we've become siloed and we've focused purely on safe ground. And I think that safe ground in a Christian context is, to some degree, the stuff that we see as output that we're comfortable with. I think that to actually contribute democratically, meaningfully to society, we have to learn from each other, and that involves engaging with really difficult arguments that exist about a whole range of issues that shape our society and the world around us, and how we want to speak into those things, and whether or not we can speak into those things with a unified voice, or whether or not we respectfully differ and find ways to communicate that difference lovingly. So I think that there is a real need to perform the mission of God that the world so desperately needs. But I also think there's a fundamental need to engage the people of God with debate, with learning, and with respect for the ability to respect a difference. And manage themselves in how we go about contributing to the society that we're part of.
Thank you. Michele?
Thanks, Winifred. Look, your question came in two parts. Let me tackle them a little bit separately and then bring them together. I mean, you ask first of all on the question of Australians, I don't know, hostility towards religion. I mean, I think I would class it a little bit differently. I think a lot of mainstream Australians are very ambivalent about religion. And I also think they're a little frightened of it. And I can remember saying to a friend, an Australian friend, after I, migrated here from the United States, something along these lines, that they seem to be frightened of the sort of deep emotions that characterize people who are very devout. And my friend said, no, you misunderstand. She said, they're ambivalent about any deep emotion about anything whatsoever. So they were sort of relocating it as a kind of cultural feature of being Australian, which I thought was interesting. So I think there is that ambivalence. I think that the young people's decline in positive regard for democracy, I think there are two components of that. One is that they actually don't know any other system, and their forebears might not know any other system other than a democratic system. That living memory of what it is like to live under fascism, for most white Anglo-Australians, right, is just not there. It's just not there. For people who have come here as refugees from those political systems, that living memory is there, but it becomes complicated. But I now want to link those two things together by saying, both in terms of the decline of a belief in democracy and some of the, hostility stroke ambivalence towards religion, both of those are connected, in my view, as part of a broader trend towards the decline of trust in institutional anything, okay? Political institutions and religious institutions. And in both cases, I would say that the institutions themselves have not yet done the work, the hard work, of taking a good look at themselves. So you've got scandal after scandal. I'm sorry to now raise uncomfortable things, but I hope we can have this as a respectful conversation. Scandal after scandal in the Catholic Church in regard to child sex abuse. There was a scandal in Australia in the Jewish community, also in relation to child sex abuse, that was squashed except for a couple of brave people. Lots and lots of issues around government. Yes, and absolutely, First Nations people not being included in democracy and their laws not being respected. So there are some good explanations for why people are not trusting institutions that they formerly relied on. We're seeing and hearing that loud and clear, but what we're not seeing necessarily are those institutions rising to the challenge and rising to the opportunity to be their best selves in terms of the service that they offer to those whose support they need, lest they collapse. So that's where I think we're at on that score.
Yeah. And surely the virtues of humility and grace help us to have those conversations.
Indeed.
Halim?
Yeah. I think the most important thing we could do is raise the level of religious literacy for those who identify with a religion and for those who do not or identify with another religion. I think there's an important need to dispel a lot of the misconceptions, both for those who adopt or embrace a particular faith and those who follow another one or none at all. If we look, and I think it's important to draw the distinction between the foundational teachings, the main message of a religion, and what it became, centuries and so down the track. And often when you look at the original message, the founding teachings of the prophet of that religion, the founder of that religion, you'll find inclusivity, pluralism, an embracing of principles that align with human rights and democracy and being able to coexist with difference. It's really only later on down the track that you get the exclusivity and the, hard demarcations between us and them, and rigidity that has led to conflict, which often becomes quite embedded in the way people think of themselves and the other. So I think raising the level of religious literacy is an important step for us.
But unfortunately, some of that lingers on in the current situation as well.
I think, can I just make one observation? I think that's absolutely spot on, that Halim's point about raising the level of literacy, religious literacy. I come from a country where religion is taught in schools. It's on the curriculum, and that's every state school in the country. And that doesn't mean, a particular faith is taught above others. Every child has a basic understanding of the five major faiths of the world. And one of the things which I find really difficult to adjust to is coming into a country where that isn't an entitlement, or even there isn't an understanding of why that might matter. And in a multicultural country and a multi-faith democracy, I think it's absolutely essential that we address that as an issue, and we start to think, that it's great to have Anglican schools and Catholic schools and Lutheran schools, but actually it's also really important that we have an understanding about how we interact with and how we respect people of other faiths. And certainly, if you work in something like prison chaplaincy, as an example, that is a multi-faith environment. And it was really helpful to me when I was going into a prison environment to actually have a basic understanding of Islam and Judaism and other faiths, because I was working alongside people. And I just think we live in a world that's so diverse, in a country that's so diverse. It's somewhat odd that we don't seem to want to engage with a deeper understanding of where people come from and why they believe what they believe, or don't.
Father Duncan, to be fair, there is a lot of interfaith work that does go on in Australia. So the education system, I think you're absolutely right. There are, because states and territories control education, you've got very uneven approaches to what that means. But there have been, over decades, there has been a lot of effort, I think, to do exactly what you're saying, to increase that interfaith contact, understanding, sharing, and exchange. I think that one of the big challenges that we're facing, this is on the slide that, got mangled. So in the 2016 census, 30.1% of people said that they had no religious affiliation. By the 2021 census, which is the most recent one, that figure rose to nearly 40%. It's 38.9%. Now, this year, we are just on the verge of the new census, right? Every 5 years. So I think they're going to start collection around July of 2026. And I am predicting that figure of no religious affiliation is going to tip well over into the 40s, potentially even approaching the halfway mark. So I think, as much as anything, Halim's point about religious literacy is really important, but it's also a conversation about why it's important to have that literacy, even if you yourself are not religious. Because the problem, that, as I see it, is that people who are not religious think, I don't have to worry about that at all, and I don't need to understand it, and it's none of my business. But your point, Father Duncan, which is that in a multicultural, pluralistic society, it's everybody's business, I think that's a narrative that we could do better at promoting, perhaps.
If I might say, I think one of the reasons why it's so important for non-religious people and people of other faiths to know about my religion, for example, is that you can hold people accountable. People do things in the name of religion, and I think it's important to be able to say, no, your religion doesn't permit that. I mean, Judaism doesn't permit the genocide that's been going on in Gaza for 2 years.
Correct.
Islam doesn't permit, the Bondi, if that was the motivation, or other, acts of terrorism and so forth. Christianity doesn't permit the kinds of things that you mentioned, Michele, about, child abuse and those sorts of things. So, I think by everybody understanding religion, we enrich ourselves by understanding a way of viewing and being, or alternative ways of viewing and being. But we also are able to, I think, understand one another better and hold each other to the highest standards that I think everybody aspires, particularly, which is particularly important in a multicultural society like our own.
I feel as though we've just spent the first hour and gotten to some hard topics and a degree of trust. And now we'll sign off. And the only thing I can add is that it's just been such an incredible privilege to hear you guys talk about these. I'm very grateful for this conversation. And I really do think that, you know, part of the mission with the festival is to have conversations like this in a format that people can listen to for free and in depth. And it's just been wonderful. I know that we could have gone on for another 5 hours and seen Michele's slide and debated every dot point, but we do have to finish there. So I would invite the audience and the panel to thank the other speakers.
Thank you for having us,
Everyone.
Winifred, and thanks to everybody else for a really stimulating session. I've got to
Yes.
rush off to another meeting now, but
Yeah.
thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Well, thanks,
Bye-bye.
Michele.
Thanks.
And bye, everyone. I'm going to sign off and say thank you again. Bye now.